3 Deaths Before Christmas. Dear listeners, welcome back to Tea Time Mysteries. I'm your host Henry, and I'm glad you're here. Wherever you're listening from across Asia, these cosy Miss Marple mysteries bring us together. Tonight's story was chosen by our community. Thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Now pour your tea, and let's begin. Chapter 1. Holly, Ivy, and an Unseasonable Silence. St. Mildred's village always prided itself on being particularly beautiful at Christmas. Nestled among gentle hills and hedgerows trimmed with frost, the village seemed designed for greeting cards and sentimental recollection. The cottages, with their sagging roofs and latticed windows, wore garlands of holly and ivy as naturally as if they had grown there. Every December, without fail, St. Mildred's hosted its annual Christmas fair on the village green, a modest affair of mulled wine, home-baked mince pies, and the sort of earnest craft stalls that sold knitted scarves and hand-carved nativity sets. Nothing very exciting ever happened, which was precisely the point. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her dove-grey coat and sensible woolen scarf, observed all this from her place near the tea table, hands folded neatly over her handbag. She had arrived early, as she always did, partly from habit and partly because arriving early allowed one to see people before they became conscious of being seen. It was an oddly mild afternoon for December. The frost had melted by noon, leaving the grass damp and faintly treacherous. Miss Marple noticed several villagers stepping carefully, though she doubted many of them truly knew why. People were always more cautious when they sensed, without understanding, that something was amiss. The bell of St. Mildred's church chimed 3 o'clock, and with it came the gentle hum of village conversation. Mrs. Hargreaves, who ran the post office, was already speculating aloud about the weather. Colonel Whitcomb, retired and upright despite a stiff leg, complained about the lack of proper winter. Dr. Linton stood nearby, smiling in his professional, reassuring manner, while accepting a cup of tea he clearly did not want. At the far side of the green, Lawrence Pembroke surveyed the proceedings with an expression that suggested he found them faintly ridiculous. Pembroke had moved to St. Mildred's only 6 months earlier, purchasing Hawthorne House, an elegant but slightly dilapidated Georgian residence at the edge of the village. He was a man in his late 50s, with carefully groomed hair, well-cut tweeds, and a manner that implied long familiarity with being obeyed. Rumour, which in St. Mildred served the same function as a census, held that he had made his money in publishing. Others said finance. A few, more imaginative, suggested something faintly disreputable abroad. Miss Marple, stirring her tea, noted that Pembroke did not mingle. He stood apart, nodding when spoken to, smiling when required, but keeping a subtle distance. That alone meant very little. Many people preferred distance, but it was the way others adjusted themselves around him, voices lowering slightly, glances flicking toward him, that caught her attention. "Such a generous man," Mrs. Bantry murmured beside her, referring to Pembroke with unmistakable approval. "Donated nearly £100 to the church roof fund, and just before Christmas too." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "People are often very generous at Christmas." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "Oh, Jane, you always say things like that as though there's something behind them." Miss Marple smiled and sipped her tea. The fair progressed in its accustomed fashion. Children clustered around the sweets stall. The vicar's wife sold hand-painted ornaments with earnest enthusiasm. Somewhere, a gramophone crackled out a carol that was slightly too cheerful for its own good. It was just after 3:30 that the scream cut through the village green. It came from near Hawthorne House, sharp and sudden, the sort of sound that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to the nerves. Conversation faltered, then stopped. For a moment, no one moved at all. Miss Marple set her teacup down carefully. Then there was movement. People hurrying, voices calling, a sense of collective alarm. Colonel Whitcomb was the first to start toward the path leading to Hawthorne House, leaning heavily on his stick but moving with surprising speed. Dr. Linton followed close behind, his medical instincts already alert. Miss Marple walked more slowly. She had learned, over the years, that haste often blurred what was important. Near the edge of the path, beneath a bare-limbed yew tree, a young woman stood frozen, one hand clapped over her mouth. Her face was white beneath her woolen hat. "It's Mr. Pembroke," she said faintly, to no one in particular. I went to ask about the raffle prizes, and the door was open." The front door of Hawthorne House stood ajar. Inside, the hall lay in shadow, smelling faintly of polish and pine. A Christmas wreath hung crookedly on the banister, one ribbon trailing loose, as though it had been caught and torn. Lawrence Pembroke lay at the foot of the stairs. He was sprawled awkwardly, one arm twisted beneath him, his head at an unnatural angle. Blood darkened the edge of the stair, startlingly vivid against the polished wood. Dr. Linton knelt at once, fingers already at Pembroke's neck. He did not need long. "I'm afraid he's dead," he said quietly. There was a collective intake of breath. Mrs. Hargreaves crossed herself. Someone began to cry. The vicar murmured something about calling the police. Colonel Whitcomb stood rigid, his face grim. Miss Marple looked, not at the body but at the stair. The fall was plausible enough. The stairs were narrow, polished to a sheen. A misstep, a slip, a cracked skull. It would have been a very ordinary accident. But there were details that made her uneasy. The way the wreath ribbon lay, torn rather than fallen. The faint scuff marks near the top step. The peculiar stillness of the house, as though something had been interrupted rather than concluded. And then there was the young woman by the door. Miss Marple turned to her gently. "My dear, what is your name?" "Emily Carter," she said, her voice trembling. "I help Mr. Pembroke with the house. Cleaning and such." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And you say the door was open?" "Yes, he always keeps it locked. Always. I thought it was strange." Miss Marple nodded. People who always did things one way were often very noticeable when they did not. The police arrived within the hour, their cars incongruous against the holly-decked green. Statements were taken, heads shaken, theories formed with remarkable speed. An unfortunate accident, surely. Perhaps Mr. Pembroke had been unwell. Perhaps he had been drinking. Perhaps... Miss Marple listened quietly. By early evening the village had begun to talk. St. Mildred's had known deaths before, of course. Old age, illness, the gentle passing that allowed for casseroles and condolences. But this was different. This was sudden, untidy, disturbing. And as Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk past windows glowing warmly with Christmas lights, she thought, not for the first time, that human wickedness had a distressing habit of intruding most insistently where it was least welcome. 3 weeks remained until Christmas, and already St. Mildred's peace had been broken. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Mistletoe. By the following morning, St. Mildred's had adjusted itself to tragedy with remarkable efficiency. The Christmas fair was spoken of in the past tense, the scream already acquiring a faintly theatrical quality in retelling. Hawthorne House stood closed and dark, its wreath removed by the police and its front door now firmly locked. The village green looked precisely as it always had, which somehow made Lawrence Pembroke's death feel all the more unreal. Miss Marple sat at her window, knitting an entirely unnecessary scarf while watching Mrs. Hargreaves cross the road to deliver the post. The rhythm of the needles steadied her thoughts. Death, she had long observed, rarely disturbed routine for very long. People preferred the comfort of habit, even when habit carried unease within it. The official verdict, pending further inquiry, was accidental death. Inspector Finch, a conscientious man with a thin moustache and the slightly harassed air of someone unaccustomed to village subtleties, had been very clear on that point when he called the previous evening. No sign of forced entry, he had said. Stairs were polished, weather's been damp, and the deceased was alone in the house. Unfortunate, but not suspicious. Of course, Miss Marple had replied gently. Accidents do happen. Inspector Finch had looked relieved. Now, as Miss Marple gathered her coat and handbag, she reflected that accidents also had a habit of occurring at very convenient moments. The first house she visited was that of Mrs. Bantry, who had already prepared tea and an impressive selection of ginger biscuits, as though bracing herself for what she termed the inevitable discussion. "It's such a shock," Mrs. Bantry said for the third time, settling into her chair. "One simply doesn't expect these things in St. Mildred's, and so close to Christmas." "No," said Miss Marple, "one never does." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "Between ourselves, Jane, I never trusted that man. Too polite by half. And did you notice how he kept his distance, as though he were watching us?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, knitting. "I noticed. And then there's that girl, Emily Carter. Very devoted, I suppose, but she looked quite hysterical." One has to wonder whether she wasn't trying to frighten him on the stairs. Young people can be terribly emotional. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Young people can be," she agreed. though older ones can be quite emotional too when sufficiently provoked. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Provoked? What do you mean? Oh, nothing in particular, said Miss Marple. Merely that people rarely fall without a reason, whether physical or otherwise. Later that morning Miss Marple called at the post office, ostensibly to buy stamps. Mrs. Hargreaves, whose sense of discretion had always been more theoretical than practical, wasted no time. They say he was arguing with someone, she whispered, sliding a book of stamps across the counter, just before the fair. Do they? Said Miss Marple. Who says so? My nephew, said Mrs. Hargreaves importantly. He was delivering coal to Hawthorne House. Heard raised voices. A woman's, I believe. How interesting, said Miss Marple. And did he see anyone? Well, no, but that doesn't mean anything. People can be very quick about these things. Yes, said Miss Marple, they can. Outside, the church bells began to ring for morning service, their sound drifting softly over the rooftops. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the green, where she encountered Colonel Whitcomb striding with purpose, his stick tapping sharply against the pavement. Good morning, Miss Marple, he said. Grim business, all this. Very grim, she agreed. You were one of the first to reach Hawthorne House yesterday. Army training, he said stiffly. Instinct. And did you notice anything out of place? He hesitated. Those stairs were like glass. I told him so once. Told him it was an accident waiting to happen. Yes, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. Did he agree? No. He laughed. Said he liked things just so. Colonel Whitcomb frowned. You don't think... I think, said Miss Marple gently, that liking things just so can be a dangerous habit. The police inquiry continued quietly throughout the day. Inspector Finch spoke again with Emily Carter, who remained pale and subdued, insisting she had arrived only moments after the fall. Dr. Linton confirmed there were no obvious signs of struggle. Everything pointed quite comfortably toward misfortune. It was at the vicarage that Miss Marple heard the first truly discordant note. Mrs. Avery, the vicar's wife, poured tea with unnecessary force. I can't help feeling, she said, that there's something being overlooked. Oh? Said Miss Marple. Lawrence Pembroke had been receiving letters, disturbing ones. He mentioned them to my husband only last week. Anonymous, I believe. Did he say what they concerned? Asked Miss Marple. Mrs. Avery lowered her voice. His past. He seemed anxious, as though someone had found him. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly, then resumed. That must have been very unsettling for him, she said. Yes, and then this happens, just when he was considering leaving St. Mildred's altogether. Leaving, said Miss Marple, and so he said, selling Hawthorne House after Christmas. Miss Marple smiled faintly. So, a man on the point of departure, unsettled, receiving anonymous letters. It was a pattern she had seen before, often in connection with people who believed they had left certain things safely behind them. As evening fell, Christmas lights blinked on one by one, brave and cheerful against the encroaching darkness. Miss Marple returned home, her mind busy with small observations that refused to arrange themselves neatly. The torn ribbon, the open door, the raised voices no one had seen but many had heard, and above all the curious sense that Lawrence Pembroke's death, while shocking, had not surprised everyone equally. She sat by her fire, knitting forgotten, and thought of a woman she had once known in St. Mary Mead, smiling, helpful, and capable of extraordinary patience until the moment it ended. People, Miss Marple reflected, were very good at appearing harmless, especially in villages like St. Mildred's, where everyone knew everyone else, or believed they did. Outside, snow began to fall at last, light and tentative. Settling softly on the hedges and rooftops, Christmas was drawing nearer, and something else she felt quite sure was drawing nearer too. Chapter 3. The Shape of an Accident. Snow changed St. Mildred's without altering it. By the second morning after Lawrence Pembroke's death, the village lay beneath a thin, careful blanket of white. Footsteps marked the paths like tentative questions, and the rooftops gleamed with a deceptive purity. Miss Marple, peering out from behind her curtains, thought, as she so often did, how snow had a way of smoothing over irregularities without truly concealing them. One needed only to look a little closer. She set out just after 10, her boots sensible and well worn, her handbag heavier than strictly necessary. The cold had sharpened the air, and with it, the villagers' appetite for speculation. Snow encouraged intimacy. People lingered, spoke longer, drew closer together. Her first stop was the butcher's, where Mrs. Clark was already deep in conversation with 2 customers. "And I say," Mrs. Clark was declaring, "you don't just tumble downstairs like that unless something's helped you along." Miss Marple waited patiently. "Oh, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Clark, lowering her voice with theatrical discretion. "Awful business, isn't it?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "very sad." Mrs. Clark leaned over the counter. "Between you and me, I never liked that house. Hawthorne House, I mean. Always felt cold, and that man, well, money like that doesn't come without trouble." "No," said Miss Marple, "and it rarely does." As she left, Miss Marple noted how readily people assigned guilt to abstract notions. Money, houses, outsiders, anything that spared them the discomfort of suspecting someone familiar. She turned her steps toward Hawthorne House itself. The police tape had been removed, and a faint path had been cleared to the door, though no one had yet gone inside. Miss Marple paused at the gate, not to trespass but to observe. The yew tree stood dark and watchful, its branches heavy with snow. Beneath it the ground showed a faint disturbance, now softened by snowfall. A voice behind her made her start. "I thought I might find you here." Emily Carter stood a little apart, her coat too thin for the weather, her expression uncertain. "Good morning, my dear," said Miss Marple. "You mustn't catch cold." Emily gave a weak smile. "I just wanted to see it again. I keep thinking I should have noticed something sooner." "That's a very natural feeling," Miss Marple said gently, "but rarely a useful one." Emily hesitated. "Inspector Finch says it was an accident, but it doesn't feel like one." Miss Marple glanced toward the house. "Why not?" "The stairs," Emily said. "They were slippery, yes, but Mr. Pembroke always went down them very carefully. He even told me once that he never carried anything on them. Hands-free, he said, like a rule." "Did he break rules often?" Miss Marple asked. Emily shook her head. "No, he liked control. Everything had its place." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "People who like control can find its loss quite upsetting." Emily swallowed. "He was frightened lately. Not all the time, just at odd moments." "Of what?" asked Miss Marple. "I don't know. He wouldn't say." "Only that things had a way of catching up." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "They do," she agreed. "Almost without exception." Emily looked at her with sudden intensity. "You think someone pushed him?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that accidents are often shaped by human hands, even when they appear otherwise." Emily shivered. Whether from cold or thought, Miss Marple could not say. That afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Linton arrived just after luncheon, stamping snow from his shoes and wearing the faintly apologetic expression of someone paying a social call under professional pretense. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "Not at all," said Miss Marple. "I was just about to make tea." He accepted gratefully and settled into the armchair opposite her. "I wanted to ask your opinion." "That's very flattering," she said mildly. Dr. Linton hesitated. "You see, I've been thinking about Pembroke's fall. The angle of the injury, the timing." "Yes?" said Miss Marple. "It was quite efficient," he said slowly. "A fall can kill, certainly, but this one did so immediately. No attempt to break the fall, no instinctive reaction." Miss Marple's knitting clicked softly, as though he were surprised. "Yes," said Dr. Linton, "or incapacitated." They sat in silence for a moment. "Did you notice anything else?" Miss Marple asked. Dr. Linton nodded. His pulse watch. It had been removed and placed neatly on the hall table. "How thoughtful," said Miss Marple. "Exactly," said Dr. Linton. "Too thoughtful." After he left, Miss Marple sat very still, her needles idle. Neatness, she reflected, was often mistaken for innocence. In her experience, it was more frequently a sign of planning. By evening, the village had produced its first clear suspect. It was Emily Carter. She was there, people said. She admits it. She depended on him. Young women do desperate things. Miss Marple heard it all at the Women's Institute meeting, where talk of Christmas puddings quickly gave way to darker themes. She noticed who spoke eagerly, who cautiously, and who not at all. Mrs. Avery notably said very little. As the meeting broke up, Miss Marple fell into step beside her. "You were quiet tonight," Miss Marple observed. Mrs. Avery sighed. "I dislike gossip." Yes, said Miss Marple, but gossip is often where the truth hides. Mrs. Avery glanced at her. Lawrence Pembroke once asked me whether sins could ever truly be forgiven. And what did you say? Miss Marple asked. That forgiveness requires confession, Mrs. Avery replied. He didn't seem comforted. No, said Miss Marple softly. People rarely are when confession threatens to undo them. That night Miss Marple dreamed of stairs, polished, gleaming, endlessly descending. She awoke with a certainty settling gently but firmly in her mind. Lawrence Pembroke had not died alone. Someone else had been very present indeed, present enough to notice details, to arrange small things neatly, and to believe that the village would accept a simple explanation. St. Mildred's had always liked things simple. Miss Marple smiled faintly into the darkness. So had the murderer. Chapter 4. Letters that do not burn. The letters arrived on Thursday morning. They were not delivered by the postman, who would have noticed such things, but discovered instead in the vicarage coal scuttle, placed neatly on top as though someone had wanted them found without quite announcing their presence. Mrs. Avery discovered them first and brought them, pale and flustered, to her husband, who promptly telephoned Inspector Finch. By the time Miss Marple heard of the matter, the village was already humming. Anonymous letters were a serious business in St. Mildred's. They suggested intention, persistence, and perhaps most unsettling of all, memory. Inspector Finch called on Miss Marple shortly before luncheon. "I hope you won't mind my asking," he said, removing his hat and glancing around her sitting room with faint suspicion. "But you seem to have a good sense of village undercurrents," Miss Marple smiled. "One picks things up," she said, "like dropped stitches." He cleared his throat. "These letters, Pembroke received at least 3 of them. Same handwriting, no signature. References to something he did years ago. Abroad, perhaps." "How imprecise," said Miss Marple. "People who threaten often are." "They were demanding money," Inspector Finch continued, "or at least implying it." "Implying is safer," Miss Marple observed. He looked at her sharply. "You think they're genuine? Not a prank?" "Oh, I think they were very real indeed," she said. "They frightened him." "And you think whoever wrote them might have killed him?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. "Letters," she said, "are a curious thing. They outlast the writer. They wait patiently." Inspector Finch frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," said Miss Marple, "that the urge to explain oneself rarely vanishes with the explanation. It tends to reappear, in other forms." After he left, Miss Marple put on her coat and walked toward the vicarage herself. Mrs. Avery greeted her with evident relief. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I don't like having them here." "They are unpleasant things," Miss Marple agreed. The letters lay on the dining table, carefully arranged. Miss Marple examined them without touching. The paper was cheap, the ink slightly blurred where moisture had caught it. The handwriting was neat, too neat, each letter carefully formed without flourishes or haste. "A woman's hand," Mrs. Avery suggested uncertainly. "Possibly," said Miss Marple. Though men are quite capable of neatness when they wish to disguise themselves. The phrasing interested her more than the penmanship. "You cannot outrun what you have done. I know who you are. St. Mildred's will not protect you." "So melodramatic," Mrs. Avery murmured. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but also very specific." Mrs. Avery looked startled. "Specific?" "They never accuse him of anything directly," Miss Marple said. "That suggests the writer was confident he would know precisely what was meant." Mrs. Avery shivered. "Lawrence told my husband that someone had recognized him. From before. He wouldn't explain." "People rarely do," said Miss Marple, "until it is too late." That afternoon, the police interviewed several villagers again, this time with a little less confidence in the accident theory. Miss Marple watched quietly from her window as Inspector Finch stopped Colonel Whitcomb on the path and spoke with him at length. Later, Colonel Whitcomb himself appeared at Miss Marple's door. "I thought you should know," he said stiffly once seated. "They're asking questions now about Pembroke's past." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It has a way of resurfacing." Whitcomb hesitated. "He once told me he'd changed his name." "How brave," said Miss Marple mildly, "and how optimistic." "He said it over brandy," Whitcomb went on. "As a joke, I think. But now, well." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Did he say why?" "No, only that it had been necessary." Yes, she said. Necessity is often invoked where morality is absent. Colonel Whitcomb flushed. You make it sound very ugly. Human affairs often are, said Miss Marple gently. That evening snow began again, thicker this time, more determined. Miss Marple attended choir practice at the church, more for observation than hymn singing. She noted how people clustered, how conversation dipped when certain names were mentioned. Emily Carter sat alone, her face pale, eyes rimmed with red. No one joined her. Miss Marple took the seat beside her. My dear, she said quietly, you mustn't mind people too much. They are frightened. Emily gave a bitter smile. I think I did it. Yes, said Miss Marple. It is very convenient to think so. Emily clenched her hands. I didn't. I swear it. But someone wanted him dead. Those letters. He showed me one once. He said he couldn't go to the police. Why not? Miss Marple asked. Emily swallowed. Because what they knew would ruin him. And maybe someone else? Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Someone else in St. Mildred's? Emily nodded reluctantly. He said if the truth came out, it wouldn't stop with him. That is very interesting, Miss Marple said softly. After choir practice, as the villagers drifted home through falling snow, Miss Marple walked slowly, thinking of a woman she had once known, who had lived for years under a different name, always fearing recognition. She had been kind, generous, and merciless when cornered. The letters, Miss Marple reflected, were not merely threats. They were reminders, and reminders were usually written by those who felt owed something. The next morning brought a development no one expected. Inspector Finch arrived early, his expression grave. Miss Marple, he said, we've had another report. Another letter? She asked. No, he said, another death. She looked at him steadily. Who? Mrs. Elspeth Green, he replied. Found at her cottage. Poisoning, we think. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Green had lived quietly at the edge of the village for years, seldom attending gatherings, known mainly for her sharp tongue and precise habits. And, Inspector Finch added slowly, there was a letter on her table, very much like Pembroke's. Miss Marple opened her eyes. 3 weeks until Christmas, she thought, and now 2 deaths. St. Mildred's would not like this at all. Chapter 5. A pattern begins to form. Mrs. Elspeth Green's cottage sat slightly apart from the rest of St. Mildred's, its narrow windows peering out toward the fields like watchful eyes. It was the sort of house people forgot, until they had reason not to. By mid-morning, a small knot of villagers had gathered at a respectful distance, murmuring in lowered voices as Inspector Finch's men came and went. Miss Marple arrived quietly, choosing a path that kept her out of the way. She had no desire to be seen as curious. Curiosity, when too visible, encouraged people to hide things. The official word was poisoning. She took something, Mrs. Hargreaves whispered later at the post office. Something she shouldn't have. But there was a note. Yes, said Miss Marple, I hear there was. They say it was a suicide, Mrs. Hargreaves went on eagerly. Poor woman. Lived alone so long. People like that. Well, you never really know what goes on inside. No, said Miss Marple, one never does. But the police did not sound convinced. Inspector Finch called another meeting that afternoon, this time at the vicarage. A handful of villagers were invited, those with proximity, connections, or simply unavoidable relevance. Miss Marple, included without explanation, took a seat near the window. Inspector Finch stood stiffly, his notes held with unnecessary firmness. Mrs. Green was found at her kitchen table early this morning, he said. There were no signs of struggle. A cup, a bottle of cordial, and traces of digitalis. A murmur rippled through the room. She had a heart condition, Dr. Linton said. Digitalis wouldn't have been unusual in her medicine cabinet. Except, Inspector Finch replied, the dosage was far beyond what was prescribed. Silence followed. And the letter? Mrs. Avery asked softly. Inspector Finch hesitated. It matches the others. Same paper, same handwriting, same tone. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, letting the words arrange themselves. How many letters were there, Inspector? She asked. 4 that we know of, he said. 3 to Pembroke, 1 to Mrs. Green. And all anonymous, said Miss Marple. Yes. And all referring to past actions, she said. Not present ones. Inspector Finch looked at her sharply. That's right. Miss Marple nodded. Then I don't think Mrs. Green meant to die." A stir ran through the room. "Excuse me," said Mrs. Bantry. "Suicides," Miss Marple continued gently, "tend to be very personal. Letters of explanation, apologies, regrets. This letter," she smiled faintly, "was not written to Mrs. Green at all. It was written at her." Inspector Finch frowned. "You think she was frightened into it?" "I think she was frightened," said Miss Marple, "and then helped along." Colonel Whitcomb stiffened. "You mean murder?" "I mean persuasion," said Miss Marple, "which can be far more effective." The meeting ended shortly afterward, leaving behind a residue of unease that no amount of tea could dispel. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked toward the green, her thoughts occupied with a woman she had once known, very tidy, very solitary, who had followed instructions all her life and could not bear the thought of disgrace. Elspeth Green, she reflected, had been just such a woman. She stopped by the bench near the war memorial where she encountered Mrs. Parker, one of the older villagers, wrapped in layers and peering suspiciously at passers-by. "Terrible business," Mrs. Parker said at once. "First Mr. Pembroke, now poor Elspeth, and so close together." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it suggests a connection." Mrs. Parker lowered her voice. "They say she knew him years ago, before St. Mildred's." "Did she?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh yes, something to do with the continent. Vienna, perhaps, or Prague, one of those places." Miss Marple smiled. "People often remember places more clearly than events." "Well," said Mrs. Parker, "she was always very stiff about Christmas, never decorations. Said she didn't care for reminders." "Reminders," Miss Marple repeated softly. That evening Emily Carter knocked on Miss Marple's door. She looked worse than before, eyes hollow, hands shaking. "They're going to arrest me," she said without preamble. "No," said Miss Marple calmly, "they aren't." Emily stared. "How can you be sure?" "Because," Miss Marple replied, "if they thought you capable of planning 2 deaths, they wouldn't still be asking you questions." Emily sank into a chair. "I don't understand any of this. Why Mrs. Green?" She barely spoke to anyone. "That," said Miss Marple, "is often when people speak most loudly in other ways." Emily hesitated. "Mr. Pembroke once asked me to look up a woman for him, from years ago. Elspeth Green." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did you?" "No, I refused. It felt wrong." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it often does." Emily leaned forward. "He said she had helped him once, long ago, but that help came with a price." "Did he say what the price was?" Miss Marple asked. Emily shook her head. "Only that he'd hoped never to pay it." After Emily left, Miss Marple sat quietly, reviewing what she knew. 2 people, both with carefully guarded pasts, both receiving letters that threatened exposure, one dead by a fall too neat to be accidental, the other by poison that could be mistaken for medicine. Different methods, same voice. The next day brought the 3rd letter into focus. Inspector Finch arrived with it carefully sealed. "We found this in Pembroke's study," he said, "hidden behind a bookcase." Miss Marple examined it without opening. "He meant to keep it," she said, "perhaps to remind himself." "Or to use," Finch said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Possibly that." She glanced at the inspector. "Tell me, how old is the paper?" "Not new," he admitted. "A few years, perhaps." Miss Marple smiled. "Then whoever wrote these letters has been waiting." That night, the village gathered for the Christmas tree lighting, an event that had never before felt so strained. The lights flickered on to polite applause. Carols were sung a little too loudly, as though volume might replace joy. Miss Marple stood slightly apart, watching faces. She saw fear in Mrs. Bantry's eyes, calculation in Colonel Whitcomb's, relief, curious, fleeting relief, in one face she had not yet fully considered, Mrs. Avery. The vicar's wife smiled too readily, sang too clearly, and watched Miss Marple just a little too often. Miss Marple returned the look with a gentle smile of her own. 3 weeks until Christmas, she thought. 2 deaths already. And the pattern, once glimpsed, was becoming very difficult indeed to ignore. Chapter 6. The Weight of Old Sins. By the time the snow stopped falling, St. Mildred's felt heavier. It was not merely the weight of winter pressing down upon the hedges and rooftops, but something more intimate, an unspoken awareness that the village was no longer simply enduring misfortune. It was being tested. Miss Marple sensed it in the way doors closed more quickly, in the abrupt pauses when footsteps approached, and in the new care with which people chose their words. Secrets once stirred, rarely settled back into place. Inspector Finch arrived again that morning looking distinctly less confident than before. "We've confirmed the letters were all written by the same hand," he said, standing by Miss Marple's mantelpiece. "The paper, the ink, consistent, and they were posted from different towns over several years." "How very diligent," said Miss Marple. "Whoever it was liked to plan." Finch rubbed his forehead. "What I don't understand is motive. Blackmail, perhaps, but why kill? Or frighten someone into killing themselves?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because exposure, Inspector, can be more terrifying than death, especially to those who have constructed their lives very carefully." He looked at her sharply. "You believe there's a third name on that list?" "Oh, yes," she said. "At least one." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Avery. The vicar's wife welcomed her with warmth that felt just a shade too deliberate. Tea was produced immediately, biscuits followed, everything was impeccable. "You must be finding all this very trying," Miss Marple said kindly. Mrs. Avery sighed. "It's dreadful. To think that such things could happen here. One wonders how well we ever truly know people." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "one does wonder." Mrs. Avery hesitated. "Elspeth Green once came to me, years ago. She was very upset, said she had done something she could never undo." "How sad," said Miss Marple. "Did she say what it was?" "No," Mrs. Avery replied quickly, "and I didn't ask. I believe in respecting confidences." "Of course," said Miss Marple, "though confidences, when shared unevenly, can become burdens." Mrs. Avery's smile faltered, only for a moment. "She asked whether God could forgive a lie that saved a life," Mrs. Avery continued. "I told her forgiveness depended on repentance." "And did she repent?" Miss Marple asked. "I think she hoped time itself would serve instead." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Many people do." As Miss Marple left, she noticed something small but curious. A faint smell of bitter almonds clinging to the air near the kitchen doorway. Almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to someone who had once known a woman careless with her cordial. That evening, the third death announced itself quietly. Colonel Whitcomb was found in his study, slumped forward at his desk, a revolver resting neatly beside his right hand. The note was brief, typed rather than written. "I cannot face what is coming." The village was stunned into silence. 3 deaths, and still 3 weeks until Christmas. Inspector Finch was visibly shaken when he came to Miss Marple the next morning. "It's suicide again," he said, though without conviction. He was under strain. The letters, he received one too. "We found it hidden in his desk." Miss Marple nodded. "I thought he might." Finch stared at her. "You knew?" "I suspected," she said gently. He was very rigid. People like that rarely bend, they break. "But they can't all be connected," Finch protested. "Pembroke, Green, Whitcomb, different lives, different histories." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but the same fear." She rose and walked to the window. "Tell me, Inspector, did you notice how the deaths differ?" Finch frowned. "A fall, poisoning, a gun." "Exactly," she said. "Each one suited the victim's temperament. Pembroke liked control, so his death looked accidental. Mrs. Green trusted instructions, so hers resembled a mistake. Colonel Whitcomb believed in honour, so his looked decisive." Finch stared. "You're saying someone chose these endings?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Someone who knew them very well." There was a long silence. "And the letters?" Finch asked. "They weren't demands," Miss Marple said. "They were rehearsals. Each letter guided its recipient toward a single conclusion." Finch swallowed. "Who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple turned back to him. "Someone who believes she is righting an old wrong." That night, as the village church bell tolled for Colonel Whitcomb, Miss Marple sat by her fire knitting steadily. 3 deaths before Christmas. The title, she thought, was no longer hypothetical. And now there was only one question left, whether the killer intended to stop at 3, or whether St. Mildred still had one more secret waiting to be paid for. Chapter 7. The Quiet Ones Speak. After the 3rd death, St. Mildred stopped whispering. Shock has a way of silencing even the most dedicated gossip, and for a full day the village moved as though under glass. Curtains twitched less frequently. Doors opened only when necessary. People nodded to one another without speaking, as if conversation itself might summon further disaster. Miss Marple noticed, as she always did, who broke the silence first. It was Dr. Linton. He arrived at her cottage just before noon, his face drawn, his usual professional calm strained thin. He did not remove his coat. "I should have said something sooner," he began abruptly. Miss Marple gestured toward a chair. "People often feel that way afterward." He sat, clasping his hands. "Colonel Whitcomb came to me last week, complained of sleeplessness, anxiety. He asked, quite hypothetically, how long digitalis remained detectable in the body." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "And what did you tell him?" she asked. "The truth," Dr. Linton said. "Long enough to raise questions." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Truth has a habit of doing that." Dr. Linton looked at her with sudden intensity. "You think someone is driving these people to death?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that someone is reminding them of a promise." "A promise?" he echoed. "Made long ago," she said, "when fear was fresh and consequences seemed manageable." Dr. Linton leaned back slowly. "There was something else. Years ago, before Pembroke moved here, I was a junior doctor in Vienna. There was an inquiry. A child died. Paperwork was altered. Testimony adjusted." Miss Marple's eyes were kind. "That must have been very difficult." "It was," he said. 3 people were involved. 1 administrator, 1 nurse, 1 benefactor. The case was closed quietly. "And the child's family?" Miss Marple asked. Dr. Linton shook his head. "They disappeared, or so I was told." Miss Marple resumed knitting. One rarely checked such things carefully at the time. After he left, Miss Marple sat very still. Vienna, a child, altered records. 3 people now dead, and 1 woman who had asked repeatedly whether forgiveness could ever be complete. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a longer walk than usual, choosing a route that led past Mrs. Green's cottage and on toward the fields beyond. The snow had begun to melt, revealing dark earth beneath, messy, unavoidable. She encountered Mrs. Avery near the stile, her boots muddy, her cheeks flushed. "Such a relief to walk," Mrs. Avery said brightly. "One feels so hemmed in lately." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Walls have a way of closing in." They walked together in silence for a few moments. "You've known this village a long time," Mrs. Avery said suddenly. "Longer than most?" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Long enough to recognise certain patterns." Mrs. Avery smiled. "Patterns can be deceiving." "Only if one wishes them to be," said Miss Marple gently. Mrs. Avery stopped walking. "You think I'm involved?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that you have been watching all of this with a very particular sort of attention." Mrs. Avery laughed lightly. "My dear Miss Marple, I'm a vicar's wife. Observation is my occupation." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and guidance." Mrs. Avery's laughter faded. "You don't understand." "Oh, I think I do," Miss Marple said softly. "You understand fear very well, and guilt, and the power of suggestion." Mrs. Avery's hands tightened in her gloves. "They deserve to be afraid." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is often how it begins." Mrs. Avery turned away abruptly. "I must go. The vicar will be wondering where I am." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Do give him my regards." That evening Inspector Finch arrived with news that unsettled even him. "We found drafts," he said, "of the letters in Mrs. Avery's study." Miss Marple nodded. "I thought you might." "But she says they were part of her husband's sermon notes," Finch continued, bewildered. "Themes of confession, consequence." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "very adaptable themes." "She hasn't confessed to anything," Finch said. "There's no proof she killed anyone." "No," said Miss Marple. "She didn't need to." Finch stared at her. "You're saying—" "I'm saying," Miss Marple replied, "that she knew exactly which words would undo them. She chose the method, but let them supply the ending." Finch ran a hand through his hair. "But Pembroke, he was pushed." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. He broke the pattern." "Why?" "Because he intended to run," Miss Marple said. "Selling the house, leaving the village. Confession avoided." Finch's face hardened. "So she stopped him." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "A small push, a staged accident. Control reasserted." There was a long silence. "And Christmas?" Finch asked quietly. "Why now?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because Christmas is about reckoning. Birth, renewal, and for some people, judgment. The following Sunday the church was full. Miss Marple took her usual seat near the aisle. The vicar preached on mercy, his voice trembling slightly. Mrs. Avery sat beside him, serene, composed. Too composed, Miss Marple thought. At the final hymn, as the congregation stood, Mrs. Avery turned and met Miss Marple's gaze. For a moment something flickered, defiance perhaps, or relief. After the service, Inspector Finch was waiting. "She's agreed to come in," he said. "Voluntarily." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "she would." As Mrs. Avery passed them, she paused. "I only reminded them," she said calmly. "I never lied. I never forced." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "You merely chose the moment." Mrs. Avery smiled. "Truth has consequences." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "So does deciding when it should be told." Snow began to fall again as the police car drove away. Miss Marple watched until it disappeared, then turned toward home. 3 deaths before Christmas. And now, at last, the village could begin the slow, uneasy work of remembering, and of living with what remembrance brought. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Subtle Tests. By mid-December, the village had returned to its routines, albeit with an air of tentative caution. Shops were busy with last-minute shoppers, the post office smelled of ink and parcels, and the snow lay intermittently on rooftops and hedges. Yet beneath the normal bustle, an invisible tension threaded through St. Mildred's. Everyone sensed without speaking that certain truths had been unsettled. Miss Marple herself maintained her usual calm, observing quietly from her corner in the tea-room of the Red Lion. The warmth of the fire, the aroma of baking pies, and the gentle hum of conversation allowed her the perfect vantage point. People were rarely cautious when they were comfortable, and those brief moments of carelessness often revealed far more than any interrogation. She had been pondering Mrs. Avery, the woman who had orchestrated so much without touching a hand, and she knew that the only way to confirm her suspicions was through a subtle, indirect test. The opportunity presented itself that afternoon when she visited the vicarage under the pretence of delivering a plate of home-baked scones. Mrs. Avery greeted her warmly as always, yet there was a faint tension in her smile that Miss Marple had long learned to recognise. She offered tea and biscuits, arranging everything with the precision of a woman who prided herself on appearances. "My dear Mrs. Avery," Miss Marple began lightly as she accepted a cup of tea, "I hear the vicar is concerned about the choir's attendance at Christmas. Do they practice enough?" Mrs. Avery smiled. "Oh, Jane, they do their best. But it's rather difficult to get everyone in on time, especially in this weather." Miss Marple sipped her tea and let her eyes wander around the room, observing little details. The careful placement of hymn books, the faint smell of lavender, and the slight tremor in Mrs. Avery's hand as she poured cream. "You seem very composed," Miss Marple said softly, almost conversationally. "I imagine the recent events haven't disturbed your peace." Mrs. Avery's lips tightened fractionally. "We all try to maintain calm for the sake of the congregation," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "Of course, though some people, when they believe themselves unseen, act very differently." Mrs. Avery's eyes flickered toward her sharply. "What do you mean, Jane?" "Oh, nothing," said Miss Marple with a faint smile. "Merely that people sometimes leave traces of their thoughts in very small ways. A misplaced object, a casual remark, a hesitation." Mrs. Avery relaxed slightly, but not entirely. "You've always had a keen eye, Jane." "Experience," Miss Marple replied. "One learns to notice what others overlook." Miss Marple continued her visit, speaking in gentle tones about minor village news, the choir, and preparations for Christmas. Yet beneath the casual conversation, she watched closely for the slightest reaction, the smallest inconsistency in Mrs. Avery's composure. It came in the form of a very subtle gesture, a hand hovering too long over the teapot before pouring, a faint tightening of the lips when she mentioned the village council, and a nearly imperceptible glance toward the study where the letters had been drafted. Later, Miss Marple took a solitary walk through the snow-dusted village green. Each house she passed seemed to hold its own secret, yet she knew instinctively that Mrs. Avery's orchestration was the one that had rippled through St. Mildred's most profoundly. She considered the 3 deaths, the carefully staged fall, the misused medicine, and the final act of Colonel Whitcomb. Each was tailored to the individual's character, executed with precision, and accompanied by subtle guidance that suggested rather than commanded. The invisible hand had been deliberate, meticulous, and patient. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she stopped beneath the holly-laden lamppost. Patience, she thought, was often more powerful than force. By allowing people to act according to their fears and habits, one could direct events without ever touching a hand. Back in her cottage, she set her knitting aside and began reviewing her notes, letters, behavioural patterns, the timing of deaths, and reactions from the villagers. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Mrs. Avery had orchestrated the events with careful forethought, using her understanding of human nature to manipulate the outcomes while remaining outwardly innocent. 3 deaths, subtly guided by invisible hands. And yet Miss Marple knew the work was not done. There was still one crucial element she needed to observe: how Mrs. Avery would react when confronted, even indirectly, with the consequences of her actions. The final test, she thought, would reveal whether the truth would emerge willingly, or whether it required a gentle prod. And Miss Marple, as ever, was ready to deliver it. Chapter 9. Shadows Behind the Wreath. The week before Christmas had settled over St. Mildred's with a quiet, deceptive normality. Snow lay in soft drifts along the hedgerows, chimneys smoked gently, and the village glittered with decorations that made the small streets resemble a scene from a storybook. Yet beneath the surface tension coiled like a spring. Every glance, every whispered conversation carried the memory of 3 deaths that had shaken the village to its core. Miss Marple moved through it all with her usual composure, though her mind was constantly active. She had observed Mrs. Avery's reactions over the past few days with increasing interest, noting the small signs of strain that always accompany the careful maintenance of appearances. She also knew that patience, in cases such as this, was the most effective instrument of detection. On the morning of December 17th, Miss Marple received an urgent message delivered by Emily Carter. It was brief. "I think there's something in Hawthorne House. Please come." Curiosity piqued. Miss Marple set off immediately. Snow crunched softly under her boots as she approached the familiar Georgian facade. The front door, though locked as always, had a window slightly ajar at the side, letting a thin shaft of cold light into the hallway. Inside, the house was silent except for the faint creak of floorboards beneath her careful steps. Miss Marple's eyes, trained to notice the smallest irregularity, scanned the familiar interior. At the far end of the hall, near the base of the staircase where Lawrence Pembroke had fallen, she noticed something out of place, a small envelope, half hidden under the skirting board. She picked it up and recognized the handwriting immediately. Precise, controlled, careful. The letters she had examined before were unmistakable. This one had been hidden, waiting to be found. The note contained only a few words, written in the same careful hand. Patterns reveal themselves only when observed carefully. Watch, and you will understand. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. She had anticipated this kind of message, an indirect communication, leaving the observer to draw the conclusions rather than forcing the truth into the open. It was then that she heard a faint rustle from the stairs. She turned sharply, not in alarm but in curiosity. A figure emerged from the shadows. Mrs. Avery, composed as ever, though there was a subtle tension in her posture. "Jane." "Mrs. Penn," Avery said softly, as if she had expected the visitor. "I thought I might find you here." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "It seems we are both very interested in patterns." Mrs. Avery's eyes flickered, and she adjusted her gloves with deliberate care. "I merely wanted to ensure everything was in order before the holidays. St. Mildred's must not descend into chaos." Miss Marple's gaze softened. 3 deaths have already reminded this village that chaos is closer than it appears. Mrs. Avery's composure faltered just slightly. "Yes. Well, it is unfortunate." "Unfortunate," Miss Marple repeated, but also instructive. She paused, letting the words sink in. "You see, Mrs. Avery, people often reveal themselves without realizing it. A gesture, a pause, a glance. And sometimes they choose to observe what they have set in motion, rather than intervene directly." Mrs. Avery's hands clenched ever so slightly. "I only guided them," she said quietly. "I did not compel. I merely suggested what they might already know about themselves." Miss Marple nodded. Ah, but the very act of suggestion is compulsion in another form. You understood your victims very well, Pembroke, Green, Whitcomb. You knew their fears, their habits, their inclinations. You allowed them to act in accordance with your design. For a moment the silence of Hawthorne House was almost tangible. Outside, snow began to fall again, pattering softly against the windows. And yet, Mrs. Avery said, her voice low and controlled, I only corrected what the past demanded. They would have faced the consequences eventually, even without me. Perhaps, Miss Marple replied, but you accelerated matters. 3 deaths before Christmas is no coincidence. The timing, the methods, they were all suited to the individuals involved. And the letters, they were reminders of things that should never have been forgotten. Mrs. Avery looked at Miss Marple steadily. There was no fear in her gaze, only the quiet certainty of someone who believed herself justified. Do you condemn me, Jane? Miss Marple's hands rested on her handbag. No, she said gently. I merely observe, and I note that people who shape others' destinies rarely see the consequences for themselves until someone else does. Mrs. Avery's eyes softened, and for the first time a faint vulnerability appeared beneath her composed exterior. Then you understand. I understand, said Miss Marple, and now the village will understand as well, though not in the same way you do. They will remember, they will reflect, and they will learn, if they can. Outside the snow swirled and fell quietly. Inside Hawthorne House, Miss Marple and Mrs. Avery regarded one another across the shadowed hall, each aware of the delicate balance between revelation and restraint. 3 deaths before Christmas had left their mark on St. Mildred's, and now, at last, the final understanding was within reach. Chapter 10. Unravelling the Threads. By the evening of December 19th, St. Mildred's was aglow with Christmas preparations, though a certain tension lingered beneath the festive lights. The villagers moved with careful politeness, their conversations measured, their smiles faintly strained. Everyone sensed that the past weeks had been exceptional, that the ordinary rhythm of life had been interrupted, and that something profound, invisible, yet utterly decisive, had taken place. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room. Knitting needles paused in mid-air as she considered the patterns she had observed. Each death had been tailored to its victim. Pembroke's controlled nature, Green's obedience, Whitcomb's sense of honour, all exploited, all guided, and each had been carefully orchestrated through letters, suggestion, and subtle manipulations. The question remaining was no longer who, but how the final threads would be gathered and understood. Miss Marple had long since concluded the perpetrator's identity, yet the evidence required patience. Human nature, she knew, was best revealed gradually through careful observation rather than confrontation. The next morning she set out to walk through the village, stopping by the vicarage under the pretence of delivering a small basket of treats. Mrs. Avery was in the kitchen, preparing a tray of mince pies with her usual meticulousness. "Jane, what a surprise," she said, smiling warmly. "You must be taking advantage of a quiet morning." Miss Marple returned the smile. "I was thinking of the village. Quiet mornings are often the most revealing." Mrs. Avery's hands paused over the tray. "Revealing?" she asked lightly, though her tone carried a subtle note of curiosity. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Observing people, noticing small gestures, the patterns in behaviour. One can understand quite a lot without words being spoken." Mrs. Avery set the tray down and met Miss Marple's gaze. "You have always had a talent for such things." "Experience," Miss Marple said. "And a patient eye." It was then that Emily Carter arrived, clutching a folded envelope, pale and anxious. "Miss Marple," she said quickly, I think there's something you need to see. Another letter, this one addressed to me." Miss Marple took the envelope gently and examined it. The handwriting, the careful phrasing, the unmistakable tone, all confirmed her suspicions. Someone had been orchestrating events with precision, knowing exactly how each individual would respond. "Emily," Miss Marple said softly, "do you recall when Mr. Pembroke asked you to locate someone from his past?" Emily nodded. "Yes, I refused. I thought it was wrong." "And yet," said Miss Marple, "he was concerned enough to receive reminders from the author of these letters. They were guides, not demands. Suggestions, not orders. Do you see?" Emily's eyes widened. "You mean someone directed him, and everyone else?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. All 3 deaths were influenced by a single mind, the same careful planning, the same knowledge of human nature. Mrs. Avery, standing quietly in the corner, nodded faintly. "It is true," she said, her voice steady. "I guided them. I did not kill them myself. I suggested. They acted. Pembroke's accident, Mrs. Green's medicine, Colonel Whitcomb's choice. They all completed the pattern themselves." Miss Marple studied her. "And you believe this was just?" Mrs. Avery looked out the window at the softly falling snow. "I was correcting the consequences of past wrongs. They would have been undone otherwise. I only hastened matters." Emily swallowed, her hands trembling. "So you made them die?" Mrs. Avery's gaze was calm. "I made them face the truth. And the truth, Emily, is sometimes more terrifying than death itself." Miss Marple interjected gently. "But the pattern is complete. The letters, the subtle guidance, the knowledge of human behaviour, it all reveals the mind behind the acts, and that mind has now been observed both by the village and by the authorities, without any further bloodshed." Emily sank into a chair. "I never thought. I never imagined." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Human nature has its ways of surprising us. The fear of exposure, the weight of old secrets, the compulsion to act, these are forces more powerful than one expects, and they do not require forceful intervention to shape events. Subtlety is often enough. The 3 deaths before Christmas had revealed the hidden pasts of St. Mildred's residence, and Mrs. Avery had been the invisible hand guiding them. Yet, through careful observation, patience, and understanding, Miss Marple had unravelled the threads without public scandal. Later that evening Miss Marple returned home, her needles moving once more. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside the snow fell softly unbroken. St. Mildred's would survive this trial, changed, wary, but wiser. And Miss Marple, knitting quietly, reflected once again on human nature. How fear, loyalty, and memory could shape lives far more than malice alone. 3 deaths before Christmas had revealed much, and yet she knew the human heart would continue to conceal its secrets, waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. With a faint, satisfied smile, she resumed her knitting. The pattern, at last, was complete. Chapter 11. The village holds its breath. The days leading to Christmas in Saint-Spréry, Mildred's were unusually quiet. Shops were open, but the usual hum of gossip seemed muted. The air carried a sense of anticipation, the kind that comes not from excitement, but from unspoken tension. The villagers were polite, restrained, and careful not to draw attention to themselves or their neighbours. Everyone remembered the 3 deaths, each more chilling than the last. Miss Marple walked through the village on the afternoon of December 21st. The snow had thawed slightly, leaving patches of wet earth along the lanes, yet the white drifted gently in the air, like powdered sugar on the roofs. She stopped at the corner by the post office, where a small group of villagers whispered in low tones. They paused when she approached, their conversation dying as if she had the power to still their tongues. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Gemd. Parker," Miss Marple said softly. "Lovely weather for walking, though the mud is rather inconvenient, isn't it?" Mrs. Parker nodded, her fingers twisting nervously. Yes, it is. And, well, everyone is thinking about Christmas, I suppose." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course. It is easy to focus on the festive season when one prefers to ignore more troubling matters." As she walked on, she observed faces, some strained, some carefully cheerful. A few seemed too relaxed, almost attempting to convince themselves that the tragedies of the past weeks were distant, irrelevant. That evening she received a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was unmistakable. Mrs. Avery. It read simply, "I hope you are content with your observations. There is one matter remaining, and it requires delicacy. Shall I come to you tomorrow?" Miss Marple folded the note and smiled faintly. She had been expecting this. Mrs. Avery, after all, had always been meticulous, and now she sought confirmation that the web she had spun had been understood. The next morning Mrs. Avery arrived promptly, dressed as usual in her sober attire, her expression calm but guarded. She took a seat in Miss Marple's sitting room and placed her gloved hands neatly in her lap. "Jane," she said softly, "I trust you have discerned the pattern, the letters, the guidance, the unfortunate consequences. "I have," Miss Marple replied evenly. "And I must say, your understanding of human behaviour is impressive, perhaps too impressive." Mrs. Avery's lips curved faintly. "I have always believed that when the past demands attention, one must act carefully. The letters, the suggestions, they were meant to allow them to arrive at the truth themselves. Each one acted according to their nature. And yet," Miss Marple said, "it required subtle coercion, fear, guidance, suggestion. You were the invisible hand." "Yes," Mrs. Avery admitted, "but I never pressed. I merely pointed the way." Miss Marple nodded, which was more than enough. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the ticking of the clock and the distant sound of church bells preparing for the evening service. 3 deaths before Christmas, Miss Marple said softly, each revealing something long hidden. Pembroke, Green, Whitcomb, and all connected through a past that none wished to face. Mrs. Avery lowered her gaze. "It was a matter of justice, of setting things right. I did what had to be done." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "And you have been observed, every careful step noted, the letters, the timing, the outcomes. It is all clear, and now the village must live with the lessons you have taught them." Mrs. Avery's voice was almost a whisper. "They deserve to be reminded. People often forget the past, but it never forgets them." Miss Marple leaned back, knitting needles resting across her lap. "Yes, and human nature is patient, observant, and sometimes inexorably revealing." Outside, snow began to fall once more, coating the village in a pristine blanket. St. Mildred's would celebrate Christmas, but it would be different this year. The village had learned the weight of secrets, the consequences of hidden sins, and the subtle power of suggestion. And as Miss Marple watched Mrs. Avery leave, she reflected on the final truth. Subtlety, observation, and patience often revealed more than force ever could. 3 deaths before Christmas, she thought, and now understanding, for those who were willing to see, was the only gift remaining. Chapter 12. Echoes of the Past. The eve of Christmas approached with a quiet stillness that seemed almost unnatural in St. Mildred's. Snow had settled thickly along the rooftops and hedges, and the street lamps cast golden pools of light on the powdery white paths. Shops were closed early, and villagers huddled indoors, not merely for warmth, but out of an instinctive caution. Miss Marple spent the morning in her cottage, knitting steadily as she listened to the muffled sounds of the village preparing for the holiday. She had walked the paths, observed the interactions, and noted the subtle shift in tone among those who had survived the recent tragedies. Fear, respect, and understanding now mingled with the anticipation of Christmas, creating an atmosphere that was at once festive and uneasy. By mid-afternoon, a knock sounded at her door. It was Emily Carter, flushed from the cold, her hands clutching a small parcel. "Miss Marple," Emily began, breathless, "I thought you might like to see this. I found it in the vicarage attic. Old papers, letters, and documents. They relate to the events before Pembroke arrived in St. Mildred's." Miss Marple took the parcel and began to sort through the papers. They were faded, yellowed with age, and bore the official stamps of Vienna, Prague, and other European cities. Among them were letters, a report of an inquiry concerning a child who had died due to neglect and administrative oversight, and a few personal notes that revealed a network of promises, debts, and warnings exchanged among Pembroke, Greener, and Whitcomb decades earlier. "I see," said Miss Marple quietly. "So the foundation of all this was laid long before anyone in this village suspected anything." Emily nodded. Yes, and Mrs. Avery knew. She understood the connections and the guilt that each of them carried, even if it had been buried for years. Miss Marple's fingers lingered on a note penned in careful handwriting. "Some debts cannot be forgotten. Some sins demand acknowledgement." "That's what she meant," Emily whispered. "That's why she guided them." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and notice, Emily, that the guiding hand did not act blindly. Each person faced a path tailored to their character. Pembroke's accident, Green's medicine, Whitcomb's revolver, they were reflections of themselves as much as they were influenced externally." Emily shivered. "It's chilling." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently, "but also instructive. You see, fear of exposure, understanding of consequence, and careful manipulation can reveal the truth more effectively than any accusation. and those who orchestrate such events often reveal themselves subtly, not through force, but through observation. The snow fell more heavily now, settling in thick layers on the window ledge. Miss Marple closed the parcel carefully and looked out at the village. Each home held its own story, its own secrets, its own hidden truths. The past, she said softly, has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it, and those who remember it, who understand it, often hold the key to resolution. Emily rose to leave. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for helping me understand, and for seeing what no one else seemed to notice." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Observation is a quiet art, Emily. It requires patience, attention, and the willingness to notice what others overlook. Sometimes that is all it takes to uncover the truth." As Emily departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, reflecting on the 3 deaths before Christmas and the intricate web of past actions, guilt, and hidden knowledge that had led to them. The village would celebrate, the snow would glisten, and the villagers would resume their routines, but the lessons of the past would remain, subtly shaping lives in ways that only a careful observer could discern. And in the quiet of her sitting room, Miss Marple understood, as always, that human nature was both patient and revealing, and that understanding it often required nothing more than steady observation and gentle insight.